we'll just give another minute or two while everybody continues to file in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, let's go ahead and get started, everyone.
Hello all, welcome to our webinar today, ACRO's Education in Crisis series. Today we are going to talk about Afghanistan. Certainly a timely topic given everything that's been in the news. I'd like to welcome our presenters today, Amy Ulrich, Senior Evaluator at Education Credential Evaluators, Inc. Annetta Stroud, my colleague at ACRO, Associate Director of Content and Curriculum, and Dr. Hala Abu Araj, Associate Registrar at the American University of Beirut. I am Julia Funaki with ACRO International, and I turn it out now over to my colleague, Annetta.
Great, next slide, Julia. Wonderful, thank you so much, Julia, for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. In today's presentation, we are going to be providing a brief overview of Afghanistan, including the geography, history, language, and recent political history, followed by the overview of the Afghanistan educational system. And then we're going to follow it up with current admissions scenarios and the current state of education in Afghanistan. Next slide. So Afghanistan is located in southwestern Asia, and the country is roughly the size of Texas. Afghanistan is bordered by China in the northeast, Pakistan in the southeast, Iran in the west, and Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan in the north. It is a landlocked country with extensive mountain regions and contains desert plains as well. Mountains pretty much divide Afghanistan into three distinct regions. We have the northern plains, the central mountains, and the southern plateau. Afghanistan is a very multi-ethnic society, and it contains very diverse ethnic, linguistic, and tribal groups, which makes Afghanistan a little bit complicated when we are talking about recent political history, and we'll see some of that in the next slide. But we will see that we have approximately 20 ethnic groups in Afghanistan, most having their own language and culture. About half of the population of Afghanistan are Pashtuns, followed by Tajiks, Uzbeks, and Haraz. The religion in Afghanistan is Islam, is the official religion of Afghanistan, and the majority of the population is Muslim. There are, though, very small residual communities of other faiths, including Christians, Sikhs, Hindus, and Baha'i. So in Afghanistan, it really is an incredibly rich and multi-ethnic society, which absolutely plays out in the political history. Next slide, Julia. So Afghanistan, like many other countries in the region, has a very, very, very long, rich, and detailed history. For our purposes today, we did want to give a very, very brief overview of the recent political history in hopes that this will help frame and provide a context to when we start looking at the history of education in Afghanistan. So basically, a very large overview. So in 1921, Afghanistan becomes an independent nation for the first time, basically. And this again was going to be after the British were defeated in the British-Afghan War in 1921. And so in 1921, we have Afghanistan finally as its own independent country. In 26, Amanullah declares Afghanistan a monarchy rather than an emirate, and he decides he is going to be himself king. So what happens then is he launches a whole series of modernization plans and attempts to limit power of other factions and other ethnic groups in the country. And again, this is where when thinking about how the country is divided into the different types of tribes and cultures, it becomes very important when we're thinking about this politically, because many of those factions do want control of either the entire country or parts of the country. And so that then takes us to around 1933, Jar Shah becomes king. So this is going to be a really interesting period of time, because over the next 40 years of Zahir Shah as king, this is really a very stable point for Afghanistan. And in 1934, the United States formally recognizes Afghanistan as a country. So, and then moving into the next couple of decades, right? So we do know that obviously Afghanistan has had really important relations with the USSR. So in 1956, Khrushchev agrees to help Afghanistan in some of these modernization efforts, right? And so this becomes the point where the USSR and Afghanistan become incredibly close allies, right? And there are a lot of reforms during this point in time. In 1973, Khan, he overthrows the last king, Zahir Shah, and then Khan declares that Afghanistan is now going to be is going to be independent, and is then titled the Republic of Afghanistan, right? And so this is really important, because this happened with complete support from the USSR, right? And so that's pretty much how all of that started. So then in 1978, so then Khan is actually killed in a coup, and the Mujahideen is then formed, and basically to battle the Soviet-backed government. Again, that was formed in 73, right? And so the Mujahideen is actually forming out of different tribes within Afghanistan, right, into those regions outside of Kabul. So then in 1979, the American ambassador is killed, which leads the USS to cut off all of its assistance to Afghanistan. This is also the same time that USSR invades Afghanistan. So there's been a lot of push and pull in terms of who is running the country and who has the power in the country. And so between 79 and 88, between 78 rather, and over the next decade, the entire country is just in an absolute civil war. And so in 1988, Al-Qaeda is actually formed, and then in 1995, the Taliban actually takes over the government. So once that happens, obviously, then we have 2001, where America enters the war with the Taliban. And so the idea here is to show that there have been so many changes of power within Afghanistan, and there has been the history of war in Afghanistan is lengthy for decades, right? And so the political history of Afghanistan is absolutely important when we're thinking about how that has framed the educational system of Afghanistan. Next slide, Julia. The next section, we're going to be looking at the educational structure of Afghanistan. We're going to provide a historical context specifically regarding how education, the history of education, and you'll be able to see some of those important pieces in the next timeline, how that was reflected in our recent political history in the slide before. We're going to talk about the educational structure and the grading system. We'll be talking about the secondary cycle of education, and then also the tertiary and higher education programs. All right, next slide. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Amy.
Thanks, Annetta. Well, I'm really glad that Annetta was able to give a timeline of the recent political history, because it helps frame what we know of history of education in Afghanistan. The history of education in Afghanistan is very much parallel with the overall political history. And we'll see that while the modern education of Afghanistan is new and complex, its policies have changed quickly with like ebbs and flows of competing leaders and regimes, external involvement, and war. Some of the major themes kind of going through their history is religious versus secular education, and how much, you know, secular education should be taught versus the religious education, madrasas, education for women, and development versus destruction of education and culture. So early on in education, and I'm talking about even before the mid 1800s, education was rooted in Islamic education and traditional education of the Quran and Sharia law, the values, customs of each of the tribes, the Pashtunwali, of how to conduct yourself, what values are important to the group, society, the clan, and vocational skills. So there was no formal education institutions until probably about the mid to late 1800s, around between like 1968 and up until the beginning of the 20th century. So at that, before then, it was just Islamic education, and it was only for boys. So girls really had to depend on either, you know, willing brothers or fathers to provide any sort of education. Once those first couple of schools were established, it was about the same time as the Second Anglo-Afghan War. And then shortly after that, the first two secondary schools were started in Kabul, the Lisa Habiba and the Maktabi Harbiya. So they were established in the first decade of the 20th century. And just as Anetta had talked previously about King Amanullah Khan, you know, some of the downsides of him, you know, calling himself king and then trying to take over culturally and tribally in the country, he did bring a lot of good things to the sector of education. He was an advocate of education for girls. And so the first girls' school was established in 1921. Students were sent abroad for the first time for higher education in Turkey and Germany and France. Representatives from those countries also came into Afghanistan and helped establish curriculum. Compulsory primary education was, you know, it was made compulsory for all. The Ministry of Education was established, and modern education started to reach outside into the more rural areas of Afghanistan rather than just in Kabul. So another part of people being kings and then somebody wanting power and overtaking is that every time that happens, there were, you know, differences in policies for what had been established or what was going to be established. So, you know, as we go into this very progressive period of the early 20s and 30s, we see like Amanullah Khan getting, you know, exiled for his views of wanting more education for girls and things like that. And another leader, Habibullah Kalkani, who he just gets rid of all the female education policies. And then sure enough, the next year, there's a new person. So, you know, it's good to think about, you know, what we're seeing right now in terms of the Taliban coming back into power in Afghanistan and what is happening with the state of education for girls and women was happening off and on early in the 20th century as well. When Nadir Shah Khan, when he came into power, that was a very progressive time as well. Kabul University was founded in 1932 with the establishment of the Kabul Medical Faculty. That's now known as the Kabul University of Medical Sciences. And Afghanistan made the growth of Kabul University a priority. And throughout the, you know, from the 30s through to the Soviet occupation, there was, I mean, Kabul University was a top research university in Central Asia, and it attracted many foreign students and professors. Now, this is where things start to get a little bit more murky in terms of the Soviet occupation. That's where the push and pull from different outside and external forces comes, specifically with the USSR and the US and Saudi Arabia. So, you know, there were good things happening in Afghanistan in terms of, with the Soviet occupation, women were included more in education and in the workplace. A lot of students were given scholarships to study abroad, but the downside was that there was a lot of pro-Soviet, maybe propaganda in the curriculum. And so a good deal of those students who left Soviet-controlled schools during that time turned to Islamic madrasas for education in the south and western parts of Afghanistan along the Pakistan northwest frontier province. So fearing for the Soviet indoctrination of Afghans, the US and Saudi Arabia agreed to provide aid to Afghanistan and the Mujahideen, the fighters. And unfortunately, that meant that the Islamist leaders in Pakistan were eventually able to use that aid to build many of the radicalized madrasas, those religious schools among the Afghan refugee camps along the border, and that helped indoctrinate the students to become the jihadist warriors. So I think it's, you know, important that we take into account and accept responsibility for some of what's happened throughout history. Some of those Talibs went on to establish the Taliban, or the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, in the early 90s, and captured Kabul. And during the Taliban regime, as we know, female university students were no longer allowed to attend school or teach. Not only did the Taliban close all of the girls' schools and regress the education sector, but many of the existing schools were converted into madrasas. The only opportunity during that time for females in education is that some were still allowed to go through the Kabul medical faculty, as women during that period were only allowed to receive care from female medical staff. The primary and secondary curriculum also changed, eliminating art, music, history, geography, and foreign languages, which is something that we're looking to see if that will change at all with this second Taliban takeover. They've said that they're not going to be implementing any changes to that curriculum, but I don't know what will happen. And then with the US invading Afghanistan in 2001 and working to redevelop the country's education system, many more training centers and universities have been established, and teacher training colleges, a lot of teacher training going on. And I think probably the biggest thing within the last 20 years is the private education sector really blossomed. We went, you know, from having just one private university in 2003 of Cardan University to more than 128 private institutions as of earlier this year. So we can go to the next slide, Julia. So I know that that's a lot of history, a little history lecture, but I think it helps to frame what we see in terms of the educational structure and what credentials the students receive as well. So this is from ECE. We created this chart of the education structure, and you can see the primary education is 6 years, then 3 years of lower secondary education. There's both the academic tracks of the lower secondary as well as the madrasa, the religious institutions. And then that goes into the upper secondary portion of regular tracks, of academic tracks. There's also branches of vocational secondary education and there are madrasa upper secondary education tracks as well. Once the students complete 12th grade, they can go on to take the concours entrance examination that will then allow them into higher education programs. The concours is very competitive, and it is not required by most of the private institutions. A lot of those institutions do have their own entrance examinations. So it is possible for a student with a 12th grade graduation certificate to not take the concours and still be eligible for higher ed. Excuse me for just a moment. At the higher education part of the ladder, we can see over on the far right, the 14th grade graduation diplomas. These would be teacher training programs at the college level, as well as some of the vocational or professional trades, like their business colleges. And at the same time, we have the health science diplomas in fields like, radiology, excuse me, nursing and midwifery, some of those fields. Bachelor's degrees that are typically 4 to 5 years in length, and then go up to a master's degree. There are no PhD programs at this time in Afghanistan, but there are also the professional fields on the far left of the gray boxes for the Doctor of Veterinary Medicine, pharmacy. Sorry, excuse me. I'm trying to get through being sick. Excuse me. And then the Doctor of Medicine programs up at the top of that ladder. If you want to go to the next slide, Julia. Thanks. Annetta, would you mind talking about the grading real quick? I'm sorry.
No problem, Amy.
Thanks.
Right, so the grading scale in Afghanistan is pretty straightforward. We do see that the C range is going to be larger than what we normally would expect when working with US-based systems, but we do still, in Afghanistan, we do have that D concept. So we definitely want to make sure that we do have that in there. And again, it's pretty straightforward, but again, especially with higher education institutions, always best practices to refer to the documents coming directly from the issuing institution, because at the higher education level, we'll definitely see different types of grading. Some will be based, some will be percentage points, and some will not be. And so definitely always just, here's your default scale, but always go ahead and use whatever the institution is sending to you. And with that, Amy, I will turn it back to you if you're ready.
Yes, thank you.
Of course.
I'm so sorry. It's not COVID, I swear. So as far as secondary education goes in Afghanistan, we looked at the chart of the 6 years of primary, 3 years of lower secondary, and then 3 years of upper secondary. Students receive the 12th grade graduation certificate at the culmination of upper secondary. Also in the world of secondary education, there are vocational education certificates. We don't see these very often, but we have seen them in commerce, where a student does their upper secondary track in business or accounting maybe, and then they have a vocational secondary education certificate. If you would go to the next slide, Julia. The Ministry of Education is the quality assurance body that oversees primary, lower secondary, and upper secondary education. They also have the branches that cover technical and vocational study, and they also oversee teacher training at the diploma level, 14th grade. So this is just a snapshot of the Ministry of Education website, and this is from the archived site. currently, and this is, day by day, I check this to see if it's back up or if it's secure to use it. But frequently now, if you will try going to the Ministry of Education website, you'll get a notice that it's not secure to, enter. I was hoping it was just that they were making lots of updates and providing lots of helpful information, but that's not the case. They are, it's currently not operating. And so you will need to go through the Internet Archive or the Wayback Machine to get to the site that does have information on it. And it is in Dari and Pashto. You can use Google Translate to run it through the Persian if you'd like to see that in English. Next slide. This is an example of a 12th grade graduation certificate. And I put this one in here because it had the most distinguishing format features. So with this one, you can see the outside of the border of the document. It's green, kind of moves to like yellow, gold to red. Other ones, you'll see it very much so with the red, black, and green. This is the colors of the flag of Afghanistan. And so that is included on the outside of the document on the border. We have seen some that have just been black, and they have also been verified authentic. So it's not to say that you have to have the colors of the flag in the border, but generally there are a lot of them that do. The document is issued in all 3 languages. So we have English and Dari and Pashto listed on the document, and it indicates that the student has completed secondary education, maybe mentioning the high school name or province and in the year that they completed it. And then we'll always have the signatures, the Minister of Education, the Director of Results and Certificates, and then the high school principal. Those Ministers of Education signatures, that you can see, this one is actually kind of a stamp, but that is how a lot of them are. They're done in like a green ink stamp. And there's specific ministers for different years of being appointed. Next slide. So this is usually on the reverse side of the 12th grade graduation certificate. Sometimes it is its own separate document, but generally it's on the back. With this, you can see all 3 years of upper secondary education, the different courses that are required. The school principal stamps it and signs off, and the provincial education director in their region. So with these, in the past, we have verified all of them by having the students get the document stamped by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in country. And so you can see that in the box stamp that is on the upper right. So they stamp off on it. And then once the student is in, this is from a US perspective, once they're in the US, then they submit their document to one of the embassies or consulates here to have that verified and stamped. So this one up at the top, I know it's a little bit hard to read. You can zoom in later on the PDF version, but this is from the consulate in New York. So this one had been verified authentic. Unfortunately now there's very bare bones staff still operating at least the embassy in DC. And so for not too much longer, I don't think we're going to be able to verify them this way. This brings up just a good point with everybody who's attending this webinar to, make sure that you're communicating with others in the field. If you need to compare documents formats, contact others that are evaluating these from Afghanistan, because You know, like at ECE, we do archive a lot of our documents. And so we have a lot of archives of authenticated 12th grade graduation certificates that we compare document signatures and formats to. Next slide. Okay, I will just finish my part of talking and coughing here. I'm sorry about that. But this is the upper part of the chart that I showed earlier. And this is the higher education part of the chart. And so we see the concours entrance examination there that students would take to get into some of these programs. I'll just mention with the bachelor's degrees of the 4 and 5, those durations change based on the area of study. So depending on the period of time, there were engineering programs that were 4 years, 4.5 years, 5 years. We have Bachelor of Architecture programs that were 5 years, things like that. But generally, Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Science and business programs are all going to be a US style 4-year bachelor's degree. Master's degrees are not as common in Afghanistan, but we have seen a lot of MBAs from some of the private institutions, engineering master's degrees that Annetta is going to show an example of in just a little bit. And then otherwise, students would be going to do more of their graduate studies abroad. All right. And with that, I will say next slide and turn it over to Annetta.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. Well done getting through that with that. Great. So higher education, all higher education in Afghanistan is under the auspice of the Ministry of Higher Education. Just as Amy was speaking to us about the Ministry of Education, sometimes their website does not work, it goes down. And so definitely when it is not working, when it does go down, feel free to use the Internet Archive to go ahead and access that information. So interestingly enough, there is a great wealth of information that is provided on the website for the Ministry of Higher Education. It is in English, which makes all of us very, very happy who do not do Dari or Pashtun. So as you can see, we highlighted the universities section. So in the universities section, there is some very interesting information. We have your private institutions, which are your government educational institutions, as well as your private educational institutions. And we also have specific programmatic information for master's degrees, which Amy was speaking to. There are currently 14 master's programs in Afghanistan. And so all of those details, all the programmatic details can actually be found on that site, which is really fantastic for all of us. I will say that because of this current situation in Afghanistan, the information currently on the Ministry of Higher Education website may or may not be accurate. For example, the American University of Afghanistan is still listed in the Ministry of Higher Education website, but we do know that it is not operating in Afghanistan. It is now operating out of Qatar and Iraq. So definitely keep that in mind when you are using the Ministry of Higher Education and the Ministry of Education websites. It's definitely a time of flux for education. We don't really know what to expect. So definitely keep that in mind when you are going through these websites. Next slide, Julia. All right, as Amy was mentioning, we do in Afghanistan have these 14, the 14th grade teacher training college diplomas. These programs are entered either after your upper secondary cycle of 12 years or your vocational upper secondary. These are 2-year programs in length. And you will see on this diploma, this is great because we do have all 3 languages represented here, as Amy was showing us for our 12th grade leaving certificate. So as we can see, it states very clearly that this is the teacher education department, and it's very clear that you know, they entered in 2002 and they graduated in 12 and graduated then in 2013. We do see all of those fabulous stamps and signatures that Amy was referring referring to as well. So we have lots of stamps and lots of signatures, and you're going to see that very often with records from Afghanistan for the reasons that Amy mentioned. Next slide, Julia. Here is our transcript from our teacher training college diploma. And again, these are 2-year programs that are entered after your upper secondary of your 12 years. So you can see that it's it's really straightforward and very clear. So we can see all of our list of subjects, and we can see that our grading scale is using percentage, and that is just great. One thing that we really like here, which you may or may not notice when you're going through Afghanistan records, is that sometimes you may not have credits. We really like this record because they are actually giving us credits, which allows us to, understand the weighting of each course, which is just fantastic. One thing that we can mention, Julia, do you want to go back one slide? Thank you. You will notice that the dates in the Pashtun and the Dari section of the documents are 1391 and 1392. Don't be worried or afraid. This is totally acceptable, and we want to see that because they do use a different calendar than what we use with our Gregorian calendar. So just keep that in mind as well. Definitely no red flags for that. Thanks, Julia. You want to go ahead and advance to our next record? Perfect. All right, so here is our Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering. As Amy said, programs at the bachelor level are going to be between 4 and 5 years, depending on the discipline that and the institution who is offering that. And it's no red flags or anything. It's just, dependent on the curriculum and the institution. So bachelor's degrees, we're looking at 4 to 5 years, mostly 4 for your Bachelor of Arts and Sciences. And we have, this is from Kabul University, which is a public institution in, actually, no, it's not, it's a private institution. And we can see that it was awarded in 2007. Again, super straightforward. Next slide. Okay, here, and just to let you know, we've only provided you with the first 2 years of study for this program, just as an example, but again, it is a 4-year program. So when we're looking here at the transcript, again, it's really straightforward, which is great. We have your disciplines, we have your faculty, we have your entrance, and we have graduation year, and all of that really good information. So as I was mentioning, sometimes when you're working with records at the higher education level, you will not see credits. And this is a great example of that. So for all of these, we are not seeing credits, we are just seeing the grades. And so if you were looking for any type of transfer credit, basically, you're going to have to weight everything exactly the same. And again, we have our grades that are coming to us in percentages. Next slide, Julia. Okay, here's our Bachelor of Business Administration, and this is from the American University of Afghanistan. This is a private institution, and again, bachelor's degrees. This is a 4-year bachelor degree, and again, it's really straightforward. It's all in English. It's very easy to read, very straightforward, and we really appreciate documents that are clear and straightforward. Next slide, Julia. All right, and so here is your academic record from the American University of Afghanistan, and this is really great because you can see that we are now getting all sorts of information, definitely more like we would see with American-styled institutions. We have your cumulative grades, we have individual grades, it's very clear with our credits and all of that. So definitely, we definitely see different types of gradings throughout higher education in Afghanistan. Again, so just make sure that you are referring to the proper documentation from the institution for their grading scheme. All right, next page, Julia. All right, and so this is going to be an example of one of our master degree programs from Kabul Polytechnic University. This is going to be your Master of Science in Environmental and Water Resources. Master's degree, we have 14 of them currently, and it's so hard to say currently, right? Because who really knows how many master's programs are happening right now. Anyway, there were 14 and they are 2-year programs in duration. And this is a really great slide because on the far right, we can see the back side of this document. When Amy was talking about all of the different stamps, this is a great example of that. So on the bottom left of that document, we can see that in state, in country, before they left Afghanistan, it was stamped by the appropriate body. And then over to the right, you can see a stamp that shows that this is that it has been verified as authentic from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in the States. So this is a really good example to see those types of stamps. Next slide, Julia. And the stamps again, right? There are so many and they are everywhere. Okay, and so this is going to be your record for your 2-year program. Again, really, really straightforward. We have our subjects, we actually have credits listed, which is great. And we have your numeric scores, which is excellent. You will see, again, when we're talking about the stamps, you will see on the far left, the long rectangle, that is the stamp that happens in country. And then below that, you will see a round stamp of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. All right, next slide, Julia. All right, and with that, I would love to go ahead and turn it over to Hala.
Thank you, Anata. Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about holistic admission criteria, the documents, as well as the major challenges faced by Afghani students. Holistic university admissions create a more equitable system for evaluating potential students. So rather than placing the bulk on the consideration of untraditional academic factors, namely GPA and test scores, a holistic approach includes a number of factors that may not be captured in a traditional admissions process. My experience with Afghani students is from the Education for Leadership in Crisis Scholarship Program. This program helped to support the education of qualified students from Afghanistan. It has been operational for a couple of years now in Lebanon. The program aims to offer undergraduate merit-based scholarships to Afghani female students with funding provided by the United States government. This program is designed around a strong liberal arts foundation with an emphasis on developing leadership skills during protracted crisis. Those students receive a scholarship, as I said, that covers a full year of full tuition, room and board fees, and international travel expenses. Those students, they enter at the freshman level and they graduate in their senior year after spending 4 years. This rigorous academic program provides students with excellent academic grounding to become lifelong learners and contributors in their communities. I'm going to start talking about the admission process. Afghani students, normally they submit an application to the admissions office and as well as the grades of the last 3 years at school. Grade 10, 11, and 12. And of course, they have to take the TOEFL. We inform those students to get their grades stamped and certified by the Afghan authorities before leaving the country in order to make sure that no problems will be faced when pursuing residence permit and official papers in Lebanon. Those students are requested, of course, also to sit for the SAT-1, similar to regular applicants, but they can do it during their first semester stay in the university. They don't have to do it before they come to the university. Afghani students are assigned an advisor. The role of the advisor is to make sure that the minimum requirements for document submission is done and it's there for in order to be to be considered for admission. As to the challenges, we are talking about cultural challenges, administrative challenges, and academic challenges that Afghani students face. I will start with the cultural challenges. Most of the applicants are women. This opens the theme of the mobility of women in and from Afghanistan, especially that few women are allowed by their guardians or their parents to travel to study abroad. Of course, this was pre-Taliban era, and I'm expecting now that the situation is worse. To add, with the current situation, those students are unable to travel back to Afghanistan to see their parents for the moment. And of course, with the absence of social media in Afghanistan, there's no way to communicate with insiders. As for the administrative challenges, we are facing problems with the authentication of documents for those students from the Ministry of Education and Higher Education in Lebanon. As there is no Afghan embassy in Lebanon, nor a Lebanese embassy in Afghanistan to undergo the requested stamping. Julia, if you can go back to the previous slide. So you can see that there are the stamps of, I mean, what we have is the stamp from the Ministry of Education in Afghanistan and Foreign Affairs. However, we do not have the stamp from the embassy. And this really creates problems with our ministry, with the Ministry of Education and Higher Education in authenticating documents. We try to help those students as much as we can in our capacity as a university, especially with the government work. Some problems are related to the expiry of passports of some students. They have their passports expired and they cannot go back to Afghanistan to renew it. So what they will have to do is to go to another country where there is representation for the embassy. I think now they go to Jordan in order to renew their passport. Of course, this creates, this is a very lengthy procedure and takes a lot of time and traveling and money. The academic challenges, another challenge faced by those students is really academic in the sense that they've got to have a strong English proficiency, a strong English background to fly. Most of those students are required, because they do not get the requested scores in TOEFL, they are required to take one intensive semester in English before joining the regular freshman program, just to make sure that their English is good and they can work with other students. Despite the challenges, in Lebanon, we have there are around 40 Afghan students who are benefiting from a good quality education and experiencing student life to the fullest. With that, I will turn it over to Aneta. I think Aneta.
Yeah, sure. Many of us, actually.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And thank you all for putting your questions in the Q&A section. Definitely keep doing that. And I'll turn it back over to Julia before we move into the Q&A section.
Okay, so here we are today, and post-US withdrawal from Afghanistan. And the situation in Afghanistan is not good. Many have fled. Some are still trying to flee. Sadly, dire situations as we see in Afghanistan and elsewhere continue. So our question becomes, what can we do to make a difference, and how can we help? In the practical day-to-day sharing of our work and credential evaluation, admissions and records, we can develop some guidelines, which allows for flexibility when dealing with students and scholars in exceptional and extreme situations. So we urge you to think about doing the same thing of developing these guidelines at your institution. And the first guideline I would say is having a flexible framework. A willingness to be flexible may and likely will include documentation flexibility. While the standard documents may not be accessible or even exist any longer, consider how you might be able to utilize alternative documentation. Your colleagues and the community can and should be a flexible alternative for you. They should provide you some avenues. The community of international credential evaluators are phenomenal support to one another, as our colleagues like Hala are as well. So discuss with them documents, contacts, etc., to make sure that what you're seeing is in line with what they may have seen. Next guideline, maintain records. Amy mentioned this. She talked about ECE archiving records. You should do the same. Keep copies, scans, notes of everything you encounter, any handouts you get, any sample documents you might see. Not only does it maintain the history and continuity of information, it may be useful in another situation or for another colleague who encounters a similar situation that you may have already encountered. Build a file, then take that file and build a folder, and then a library of these documents so that you have this information, these links, etc., at your disposal. If you are an international credential evaluator, the last thing I'm going to tell you is probably something you know is one of our unofficial mottos, and that is trust but verify. ACRO and others have a process of how to proceed in cases where a student claims to be a refugee or asylee. We encourage institutions to do the same. Are there any functioning offices, institutions, ministerial contacts, EdUSA officials that can verify or corroborate information that you've received? If so, use these. Network with your colleagues. What are they seeing, receiving, and learning? This webinar is an example of that. Seeing sample documents and hearing what others have learned is immensely valuable in volatile situations such as Afghanistan. So with that in mind, let's go into questions and see what we might have, and then I'll close it out with a few other additional slides. Okay, as I look at the Q&A, we're going to go ahead and answer some of these live so that you all can hear them and they're on the recording. How can you determine the language of instructions for these degrees and programs? Not sure who answered that. Was that you, Amy?
No, I did answer two in the chat box that were about bachelor degree diplomas and transcripts, and then the 3-year health science diplomas. So I answered those in the chat, but I didn't answer any of the ones in the question and the answer portion. Okay. I can if you
Sure, let's go ahead. It looks
in
like
terms of language of instruction, the language of instruction is going to be based off of what the official languages are. So Dari and Pashto. Definitely at like the American University of Afghanistan and some of the private institutions, those programs would maybe just be in English, or they would need to do some sort of remedial English prior to those programs. But like Hala mentioned, like the students going to American University in Beirut would have to do a TOEFL. So, yeah.
Okay. And the questions that you answered in the chat are the bachelor's degree diploma and transcripts always issued by the Ministry of Higher Education as well as the institution, followed up by, do you evaluate the 3-year health science diploma as the 3 years of transfer credit?
Right.
And I'll let you go ahead.
Yeah, I put an answer in there. I don't know if you can go back to the slide that had the Kabul University diploma.
Did I just pass it?
Nope, a couple more back.
Polytechnic. Yep.
And one more.
The diploma. Sorry.
Yeah. So this is the standard format for the public institutions. So for public degree certificates, I mean, obviously this one is issued in English, but they do issue the degree certificate in Dari and Pashto as well. But this is what you're going to see for public completed programs. It's going to look like this. The reverse side of it will have, like I was on the Kabul Polytechnic University example, where it has the stamps and signatures on the reverse side for the university, for the Ministry of Higher Education. There's another signature of like Education Directorate or something like that, and a bazillion stamps and a bunch of years and all of the things. So that this is what you'll see typically for a public institution. If we go to the next sample, which is the American University BBA. Yep, this one. Oops.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. Sorry. So this is like, there will be some that look a little bit different, but generally for the private institutions, they're going to use a format that looks like this, where it's going to say Ministry of Higher Ed, just in the emblem over on the right side of the document. There might be an emblem of the private institution on the left or in the middle. The name of the institution kind of, curved around like that. Sometimes I've seen them real wonky where they're kind of like off center and stuff, but they've still been verified authentic. So it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody made it in their, back room. But then with these, it'll say certificate, and then you'll have to read through the body of it to get to what the name of the degree is. So we have Bachelor of Business Administration and Finance there. And with these also at the bottom, and I think this might have been something that was brought up in another question, maybe Peggy asked this, or I can go into Peggy's thing. But you have the American University of Afghanistan president's signature. And then on the right hand, it's the president of the private Directorate of Higher Education Institutes. That's over on that right-hand side. So it's not exactly the same as the public format that we were looking at with the Minister of Higher Education. This is a president of the private sector that's housed within the Ministry of Higher Ed. So that's one part of it. And I know Peggy asked in one of the questions about, would there be any sort of like temporary degree certificate? I have only seen something like that for a private institution. I don't know if the other speakers can, add to that at all, but we have gotten like some like a certificate or a letter, maybe from like Cardan University or Bakhtar, some of the private institutions where it might say like the student completed the BBA in this year or whatever. And so we have received those. They're not called like a provisional certificate. It just would be something confirming their graduation. And yeah, and I've never seen one that is issued by the Ministry of Higher Ed as like a provisional certificate. I hope that answers her question.
Thanks, Amy.
Sure.
I see we still have a few more questions. We're getting very tight on time here, though. Let me just ask one that's in the chat. For students who have already evacuated to Iraq and complete their degrees and were unable to obtain or have their credentials signed by the ministry, how best to evaluate education and review diplomas and transcripts? Any reply from anyone there?
Yes. So basically, what we do, at the American University of Beirut, is that the admissions office asks for those students before they come to Lebanon, at least for their last 3 school years, and they are stamped from the Ministry of education in Afghanistan, as well as from the foreign affairs. That's it. So that's what we have. We do not have diplomas. We do not ask for a diploma for those students, but I mean, they bring the documents with them. That's, I hope I answered your question.
I think that was good. Let us go on. I know there's still lots of questions, but as I think if I talk through a few more things with you, you'll know that we're here. We're not letting you down and abandoning you on all this. We have information for you. The first way I would say to get involved and learn more is by joining us at our annual meeting, which is this spring in April in Portland. And also to try and keep you better informed, we have really increased our library for our on-demand learning at ACRO, including our international series. So if you see anything there that looks like it would be useful for you, please contact us, as we think they are very useful for you in training your staff. And so as I mentioned, going to ACRO or ECE, et cetera, to engage with the resources already available. ECE is simply ece.org, and there you can find lots of resources. As an institutional professional, you can go in and find all sorts of ways to access information. Keep in mind, you don't have to reinvent the wheel here. Between ECE, ACRO, and a host of other places that have information, you will find tools and you will find updates and news about what's going on and how to deal with it, things that come across your desk. And always feel free to reach out to us. That's what we're here for. Also, if any of you want to get in and do some heavy duty research and are willing to apply and follow through on it, we do have the Gloria Nathanson Fund for International Education Research. Certainly there's a lot to be done in this area. And finally, how to stay informed. We have our international activities group. We invite you to subscribe to EDGE, the electronic database for global education, and to join our monthly users group. The links are there. You can use the QR codes and get right in and sign up for those if you don't currently have access. And with that, I would like to take a moment to thank our presenters, Amy, Anetta, and Dr. Hala. We'd like to thank you for your time and your willingness to share in this area where we are all looking for answers and needing the support of good resources and good information. We thank you and we hope to meet you again on the next ACRO webinar. Bye-bye.